The 70s and 80s, oh, they were all about freedom and throwing social rules out the window. We're talking about the golden age of disco and pop. With icons like Michael Jackson and the Rolling Stones showing us how it's done. That era is still remembered as one of the wildest times in history, so buckle up, because today we're diving into all the things that were symbols of living life as a teen. Let's go! Social life. The 70s and 80s, when teens hung out at malls, blasted rock music on cassette tapes, and actually had to call each other on landlines. Social life back then was all about fun, freedom, and face-to-face connections. From cruising in classic cars to dancing at school proms, teens knew how to have a good time. So, what was it really like growing up in these golden decades? Let's take a trip back in time. Casual dating. What better place to start than with the love lives of yesteryear's teens? Teen romance was a whole different ballgame back in the 70s. Dating was all about freedom and going wherever the road took you. The whole casual thing? Totally in. No need for fancy dinners or dramatic romantic gestures, unless, of course, you were trying to impress someone with your killer disco moves. The term going steady was still a thing, but it wasn't all that strange for teens to casually hang out, go to a movie, or grab a soda and call it a day. It was all about hanging out in groups. Dates were more like social events, and you might even end up with a crew of friends tagging along. By the time the 80s rolled around, casual dating had leveled up. Big hair, big attitudes, and yes, big feelings. No one had time for exclusivity just yet. But there was still something thrilling about meeting at the mall or cruising around town in your friend's beat-up car while listening to Madonna on the radio. Teens were more likely to go out in groups, like a mini social experiment, figuring out if this was a real date. Casual dating was also made way easier thanks to the phone. No, not cell phones, those were still decades away. We're talking about the good old landline, where you'd actually have to call the person you liked. No texting, no ghosting, just boldness. But of course, you had to make sure no one else picked up the phone, especially if you didn't want your mom's nosy questions about who's that boy after you hung up. The next item is not as rebellious as this, but was pretty fun too. School dances. In the 70s and 80s, school dances were the event for teens, a chance to mingle, show off those questionable dance moves, and of course, try to look cooler than everyone else. These dances were a huge deal, especially with all the music trends going on. The 70s in particular were all about disco, with the Bee Gees and Casey and the Sunshine Band basically ruling the dance floor. Teens would pile into school gyms, rocking bell-bottoms, polyester shirts, and platform shoes, all that fashion we can't help but laugh at now. But hey, it was the look back then. In the 80s, the music scene totally switched gears, with pop and rock taking over. Teen dances were now blasting Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince. And yep, we're talking that Thriller, the one that made everyone want to moonwalk. Now, shifting gears to something else that was super cool back then, this sport was basically the definition of cool in the 80s. Surfing. Nope, not web surfing that first popped in your head, but actual surfing on the waves. It was also known as shredding the waves, and it appealed greatly to the rebellious spirit of the teens of that era. Never been surfing myself, but I can imagine the thrill of coasting along the waves with nothing but a board and a thin strap keeping me safe. Surfing became a mainstream activity in the 70s, as it used to be a niche activity for a few wild adventurers before then. Surf films like Endless Summer and Big Wednesday were total game changers, driving this cultural shift and making surfing look like the ultimate freedom ride. These flicks didn't just show how fun surfing was, they made it cool for teens everywhere. And let's not forget iconic surf brands like Quicksilver and Vans popping up during this time, giving teens the gear they needed and a whole new identity that screamed, "I'm a surfer, don't mess with me." Once you rocked that gear, no one had to ask what you were up to. Now, moving on to something that's near and dear to my heart and pretty much everyone who loves fast cars, this next entry is a total winner. Car shows. Car shows were a big deal for teens, especially those who were into muscle cars and hot rods. The era was a golden age for American muscle cars like the Chevy Camaro, Ford Mustang, and Dodge Challenger. It still is, because who wouldn't drive one of those today? Teens would gather at local car shows where they could admire the powerful engines and flashy designs. For a lot of teens, it wasn't just about the cars. The shows were the perfect spot to meet new people and dive into car culture. Sure, the cars were the main event, but the real fun was chatting with everyone and bonding over your shared love for all things wheels. The 70s also saw the rise of custom cars and mods, basically the Fast and Furious of its day. Teens were taking their family cars and turning them into something completely their own. Whether it was a new paint job, custom wheels, or a ramped-up engine, car shows became the perfect place to flex your creativity. Even though the gas crisis and stricter rules made things a bit less about raw horsepower by the late 70s, it was still a way to show off your personality with your sweet ride. Have you heard of slumber parties in the 70s? Oh, they were the thing for teens, especially girls. Slumber parties. If you weren't at a slumber party, were you even living? It was the ultimate hangout spot to spill all the tea, talk about everything, and just let loose. But don't expect wild chaos most of the time anyway. It was more about fun, laughter, and bonding with your besties. The vibe? Super chill. You'd gather in someone's living room or bedroom, throw down some sleeping bags, pile up the pillows, and have a stash of junk food nearby. We're talking chips, candy, and maybe a little homemade popcorn if someone's mom was feeling generous. And no slumber party was complete without the TV. In the 70s, TV shows were the heartbeat of teen culture. But the real highlight, movies. And then, of course, the classic games. Truth or Dare was a must, and making friendship bracelets was basically a rite of passage. Maybe you'd stay up all night, telling ghost stories, or just rambling about life and your big dreams. Honestly, slumber parties haven't changed all that much. Just swap the junk food for pizza and the stories for TikToks. Pop culture. Teen life wasn't just about hanging out with friends, it was also shaped by the music, movies, and trends that defined the era. From blockbuster films to chart-topping hits, pop culture in the 70s and 80s was bigger and bolder than ever. Teen magazines. Oh, the 70s and 80s, when teens didn't have smartphones glued to their hands, and the only way to know what your favorite celebrity was up to was by flipping through a glossy magazine. If you were a teenager back then, your room was probably plastered with posters of heartthrobs or fashion inspo. No Instagram, no TikTok, just paper and ink telling you what was cool. Teen life in the 70s was all about disco and feathered hair. Magazines were the holy grail for pop culture-obsessed teens. These mags were packed with posters, celeb gossip, and the occasional advice column that usually boiled down to be yourself. Groundbreaking, right? And let's talk about the quizzes, because how else would you know if you and your celebrity crush were soulmates? There were also tons of DIY beauty tips, like using lemon juice to lighten your hair. Spoiler, it mostly just fried it. Fast forward to the 80s and everything got bigger. Shoulder pads, hairstyles, and the teen magazine industry. But it wasn't just about celebrity worship, though let's be real, there was a lot of that. The 80s saw a shift where magazines started including more real-life issues, friendships, school stress. 17 gave fashion tips that actually made sense sometimes. And YM had advice columns that tackled actual teenage drama beyond Does He Like Me? Up next, we have a genre of music that defined teens then and still does till this day. Rap music. Before TikTok dances and Spotify playlists, hip-hop was something you had to be there for. The music wasn't just something you listened to, it was something you lived. And for teenagers growing up in this era, rap was the soundtrack to their lives. It was the late 70s and parties were popping off in the parks, powered by DJs hooking up their sound systems to street lamps. But here's the thing, DJs weren't the only stars. MCs, the rappers, started hyping up the crowd with rhymes, and boom, rap was born. At first, it was just about rocking the party, but pretty soon, these kids realized they had something to say. Whether it was about city life or social struggles, rap music became their way of telling the world what was up. By the 80s, rap wasn't just a local thing anymore. It was taking over, and who was eating it up the most? The youth. Teens were trading cassette tapes, memorizing lyrics, and trying, and often failing, to breakdance on linoleum kitchen floors. Groups like the Sugar Hill Gang made rap more mainstream, and suddenly, teens everywhere wanted Adidas tracksuits. But rap wasn't just about flexing and looking cool, it was also getting real. By the mid to late 80s, artists like Public Enemy and NWA were dropping knowledge about racism, police brutality, and life in the streets. Teenagers, especially in inner cities, felt seen in a way that no other music had ever done before. Rap in the 70s and 80s wasn't just music, it was rebellion and culture all rolled into one. For teens, it was a way to belong and to express themselves. And honestly, that hasn't changed. Just swap out the boomboxes for iPhones and it's still the same. The 70s and 80s weren't just about music and movies. They had a look, a vibe, and a style that was impossible to miss. Icon trends. From the free-spirited hippie vans of the 70s to the bold, flashy fashion of the 80s, these decades were all about making a statement. Whether it was big hair, leg warmers, or spandex, people embraced trends that were larger than life. Let's take a trip back in time and explore the signature styles that made these eras unforgettable. Hippie vans. Oh, the 70s and 80s, when gas was cheap, well, at least in the early 70s, music was loud and the world smelled like hairspray, depending on which era you were vibing with, and nothing screamed freedom quite like a hippie van. These rolling living rooms on wheels were the ultimate teen dream. The classic hippie van, most often a VW bus, was basically a mobile rebellion. Parents saw it as a moving liability. Teens saw it as a ticket to adventure. Whether you were headed to a music festival, a secluded beach, or just cruising aimlessly while blasting music, the van was the place to be. These vans were walking pieces of art. Crazy paint jobs, peace signs, handprints were all essential. Some were decked out with curtains, beanbags, or even makeshift beds in the back. If you were lucky, your friend's van had an 8-track player, so you could ride around listening to Led Zeppelin like you were on the way to Woodstock, even if you were just going to the mall. By the time the 80s rolled around, hippie vans got a bit of a makeover. Enter the era of custom vans. Teens still loved their vans, but now they were modified with plush interiors, sound systems that could make your ears bleed, and even more tinted windows. Sure, today's teens are more into Ubers and Teslas, but the spirit of the hippie van lives on. Whether it's in the form of road tripping with friends or just craving a space that feels like yours, that van life dream still calls. The next item here will crack you up even though we've all seen it in pictures of the 70s and 80s. Big hair. Yep, you read that right. Big hair, as in massive hairstyles. This was a time when teens strutted through high schools looking like they were either in a rock band or on their way to audition for a shampoo commercial. If there's one thing the 70s and 80s had in common, it was the philosophy that hair should defy gravity at all costs. The bigger, the better. The 70s gave us disco, bell-bottoms, and a whole lot of feathered hair. That perfect windswept flip wasn't just for the ladies. Guys went all in on the look too. And let's not forget the afros. The 70s saw afros reach legendary heights, and they weren't just a style, they were a statement. For those not blessed with naturally voluminous hair, the era's greatest weapon was a can of hairspray and a round brush. It wasn't unusual to see teens spending a solid 30 minutes getting their hair just right before heading out to the skating rink. If the 70s set the stage for big hair, the 80s said, "Hold my beer." The goal wasn't just volume, it was extreme volume. Perms were the go-to, and they were everywhere. The smell of perm solution in salons was practically a sign of the times. Even if you weren't chemically curling your hair, you were teasing it, backcombing it, or crimping it into submission. Rock and metal bands played a huge role in hair trends. If you were into glam rock, your hair was essentially its own member of the band. Of course, big hair came with some casualties, mainly the ozone layer, thanks to all that hairspray. But hey, style comes at a cost, right? Up next is a trend that swept teens up like a wildfire then. Leg warmers and spandex. Alright, picture this. It's the late 70s, early 80s, and teenagers are out here looking like they just walked out of an aerobics class, even if they were just heading to the mall. First, let's blame disco. The 70s were all about dance floors, flashing lights, and moving your body like you just drank a gallon of soda. People wanted to look the part, and that meant stretchy, body-hugging clothes that let them dance without restriction. Spandex to the rescue. This magical fabric clung to every inch of your body and left absolutely nothing to the imagination. It was the unofficial uniform of roller discos and questionable fashion choices.
3 down, 4 again, out!
Then the 80s arrived, and teens added leg warmers to this ensemble. And just like that, teens everywhere started rocking these fuzzy tubes on their legs, looking like they were permanently prepared for a dance battle. The fitness craze of the 80s took over like a wildfire. Thanks to people like Jane Fonda, suddenly everyone wanted to dress like they were on their way to a high-energy aerobics class. Did they actually work out? Maybe, maybe not. But they looked ready at all times. Spandex bodysuits in neon pinks, electric blues, and wild patterns were the way to go. They were paired with high-cut leotards, wide belts, and of course, leg warmers scrunched down over sneakers. Bonus points for you if you had a matching headband. While the craze faded by the 90s, these trends never truly died. Spandex lives on in yoga pants and leggings, and leg warmers pop up every now and then. Up next, rhyming and sick beats combine to start this cultural movement. The Walkman. In the 70s, before smartphones zombified everyone, the Sony Walkman was the must-have gadget. This little marvel turned moody teens into walking music videos, complete with dramatic stares out of bus windows and foot-stomping through streets. If you were a teen in that era and didn't have a Walkman, you were basically a nobody. It was like having a flip phone in the iPhone age. Before the Walkman, music was a shared experience. You either blasted your boombox in public, which annoyed literally everyone, or sat next to your stereo, tethered like a dog on a leash. But the Walkman, it was freedom in a plastic box. Pop in a cassette, slide on those foam-covered headphones, and boom, you had your own personal concert, no matter where you were. Having a Walkman wasn't just about listening to music. It was a statement. It meant you had taste. It meant you weren't stuck listening to whatever your parents were blaring in the car. Suddenly, teens could curate their own soundtrack to life. Plus, it was the ultimate I don't want to talk device. Parents yelling, headphones on, teacher droning on, headphones on. Okay, one earbud, didn't want to get caught. It was the original do not disturb sign before iPhones made it an option in settings. Of course, the Walkman wasn't perfect. For one, the batteries had the stamina of a toddler. High energy for a bit, then dead. And let's not forget the mixtape wars. Making the perfect cassette required patience, skill, and absolute devotion. Recording songs from the radio was a gamble because you had to time it just right to avoid the DJ's voice ruining your masterpiece. By the 90s, CDs took over and the Walkman slowly faded, but its legacy, untouchable. It was the first step toward today's music-obsessed culture, paving the way for iPods and streaming. If you were a teen in those decades and weren't sneaking a smoke behind the school gym, were you even living? Enter smoking cigarettes. Smoking cigarettes. Sure, smoking was cool, but it was also gross, and smoking cigarettes was practically a teenage rite of passage. Back then, smoking wasn't just some rebellious act. It was the rebellious act. If you wanted to look cool, tough, or to just like you had life figured out at 15, you lit up a cigarette. Every teen movie had at least one bad boy in a leather jacket puffing away like he was too cool to care about lung health. Even the good kids sometimes did it because, well, everyone else was doing it. Cigarettes were everywhere. They were in vending machines, gas stations, and even grocery stores. You could probably convince your neighbor's older brother to buy you a pack for the price of a soda. Plus, every other adult was smoking too. Teachers, parents, even doctors. The idea that cigarettes were dangerous was starting to creep into public consciousness, but the general attitude was still that it wasn't that serious. Cigarette ads were everywhere. We're talking magazine pages, TV commercials, and billboards with rugged cowboys basically telling you that smoking made you look awesome. The Marlboro Man was out there making smoking look like the key to masculinity, and Virginia Slims was marketing to young women like it was a feminist statement. And don't even get me started on movies. If you wanted to look like a total badass, you had to have a cigarette dangling from your lips. Even cartoon characters sometimes had smokes in hand. No wonder teens thought it was the ultimate accessory. Of course, by the late 80s, the consequences started hitting. More and more studies were proving that smoking wasn't just a bad habit, but a deadly one. Anti-smoking psays started popping up, and suddenly, cigarettes weren't looking as cool. Schools cracked down harder, parents got stricter, and by the 90s, the whole vibe around smoking had started shifting. Up next, we have a cultural movement that is a symbol of the 70s. Flower power. Alright, picture this. It's the early 70s. Bell-bottoms are flaring, peace signs are flashing, and teens everywhere are embracing the leftover hippie energy from the 60s like it's their birthright. Flower power wasn't just about slapping a daisy on your denim jacket. It was a full-blown movement, and teenagers were riding that wave like pros. Flower power was all about love, peace, and, well, flowers. Teens were anti-war, anti-establishment, and pro-good vibes. They weren't just listening to folk music and painting swirls on their vans for the aesthetic. Though, let's be real, that was a big part of it. They genuinely wanted change, whether it was protesting war, fighting for civil rights, or just hoping for a world where everyone got along. Fast forward to the late 70s and the early 80s, and flower power got a bit of a makeover. The free-spirited hippie idea blended with the rising punk and new wave scenes, creating a fascinating mix of rebellion and optimism. Think of it as flower power's rebellious little sibling, who still wanted world peace, but also had a mohawk and a leather jacket. Teens were still rocking flowy skirts, beads, and peace sign jewelry, but now they were also getting into DIY fashion, mixing tie-dye with edgy spikes. By the mid-80s, the mainstream had largely moved on from flower power. but its influence never really died. The hippie aesthetic kept popping up, and the idea of peace and love stayed embedded in youth culture. The next entry is one that pioneered the video games we play today. Arcade games. The 70s and 80s was the golden era of the arcade, a time when teens practically lived under the neon glow of game screens, chugging soda, and fighting for high scores like their social status depended on it. Because, honestly, it kinda did. It all kicked off in the early 70s, when a little game called Pong made people lose their minds over 2 paddles and a bouncing dot. It was simple, addictive, and the first sign that the world was about to get really into video games. But Pong was just the appetizer. Soon, games like Space Invaders and Asteroids had kids swarming arcades like moths to a flame. By the early 80s, arcades were the place to be. To keep the fun going, you needed a steady flow of quarters. Some kids had allowances. The truly dedicated ones, they got creative, mowing lawns, running errands, or just straight up hustling in games to win bets. Like all great things, the golden age of arcades couldn't last forever. By the late 80s, home consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis brought high-quality gaming into living rooms, making arcades less essential. Sure, fighting games kept them alive for a while, but the magic wasn't quite the same. Up next is an all-timer that just won't go away. Family picnics. Family picnics were the OG way for teens to break free from the usual grind and get some fresh air. Sure, picnics might seem a little vintage to today's teens, but back then, they were the way to spend a sunny weekend. The whole family would pile into the car with blankets, sandwiches, snacks, and drinks, ready to take over a park or beach. And honestly, it was always a win. For teens, it wasn't just about bonding, it was about getting out of the house and away from, well, everything. Another key ingredient to these picnics? The music, of course. From Michael Jackson to the Rolling Stones, it was basically a mixtape for the day. Teens would either bring their own jams or just roll with whatever the adults had playing. Either way, it set the vibe. And sure, the food was amazing, because who doesn't love a good snack spread? But it was really about spending time with the family while also carving out a little personal space. Plus, it was all about making those unforgettable memories. Now, speaking of activities that have stood the test of time, up next is one we've all seen in 70s movies, and yep, there's still a version of it today. Christmas cards. These days, you can pick up your phone and send a quick text to wish your siblings, parents, or friends a Merry Christmas. But during the 70s, there wasn't that opportunity, and teens who happened to love the holiday spirit would have to sit down and pen down their words and well wishes on cards. Christmas cards weren't just any cards, they had a unique vibe. There were all kinds of designs ranging from traditional snow scenes, reindeer, Santa, and even some with groovy patterns. It was the era of funky, bold colors, so teens would pick out cards that matched their style or sense of humor. Some teens even got crafty, making their own cards to give to friends, adding stickers, glitter, or drawings to make them extra special. Sounds cool? You can decide to make one this Christmas and surprise your family or friends. I'm sure you've seen skateboarding in movies and TV shows. Cool, right? Well, it was one of the main activities in that era. Skateboarding. Back then, skateboarding wasn't just a sport, it was a full-blown rebellion on 4 wheels. It was the era of scrappy teens, questionable safety choices, and a whole lot of style. Helmets? Rare. Knee pads? Optional. Road rash? Absolutely. The 70s were when skateboarding really took off, mostly thanks to a bunch of California kids who had more guts than sense. When the waves weren't pumping, surfers grabbed their boards and hit the pavement, giving birth to the whole sidewalk surfing movement. Boards in the 70s were smaller, skinnier, and had clay or metal wheels before polyurethane came along, because apparently wiping out on solid metal wasn't painful enough. The look, short shorts, tube socks, and hair that had never even heard of a brush. Fast forward to the 80s, and skateboarding had gone full rock star. Tony Hawk and the Bones Brigade took over, flipping and flying higher than anyone thought was humanly possible. Boards got wider and tricks got wilder. Skating also started hitting the streets hard. Curbs, rails, parking lots, basically any public property was fair game. And the cops? Yeah, they weren't exactly happy about it. Skateboarding in the 70s and 80s was pure freedom. No corporate sponsors, no energy drink deals, just teens, their boards, and the endless search for the perfect spot. It wasn't just a sport, it was a lifestyle. The next item was a status symbol and caused a major shift in how teens enjoyed music. Hitchhiking. Back in the groovy days of the 70s and the wild 80s, if you were a teenager looking to get somewhere without cash for gas or a bus ticket, you had two choices. Beg your mom for a ride, good luck with that. Or stick your thumb out and hope for the best. In the 70s, the whole free spirit movement was in full swing. Young people were all about adventure, rebellion, and seeing where the road would take them, sometimes literally. Hitchhiking fit right into that lifestyle. It was cheap, spontaneous, and had just enough risk to make it feel exciting. Plus, with no cell phones, no GPS, and no Uber in your pocket, you kind of had to get creative when it came to transportation. Then it was the 80s, and while hitchhiking was still a thing, the vibe started shifting. Movies and news stories were full of stranger danger warnings, and suddenly, hopping into a random car seemed less like an adventure and a little more like the beginning of a horror movie plot. But that didn't completely stop teens from doing it. If you lived in the suburbs or out in the middle of nowhere, you still had to get to places. Sure, hitchhiking was never technically safe, but back then, a lot of kids saw it as normal. You'd see some teenager on the side of the road with a backpack and a cardboard sign, hoping to get to a concert or just a friend's house. Some even made it cross-country this way. Of course, there were the occasional horror stories, but for every creepy tale, there were a dozen kids who got where they needed to go, no problem. By the late 80s though, hitchhiking was fading fast. More teens had access to cars, the fear factor had gone up, and society in general was cracking down on the whole jump in with a stranger thing. Still, for those who lived it, hitchhiking was part of the adventure of growing up. Games. Time to talk about the golden age of teenage rebellion, and no, not sneaking out to parties or spray painting alleyways. We're talking about dimly lit basements, piles of dice, and stacks of character sheets as a group of teens prepared to fight goblins or rescue princesses. Dungeons and Dragons. Back in the 70s and 80s, Dungeons & Dragons was the ultimate nerd pastime. If you were a teenager into sci-fi, fantasy, or just had a flair for the dramatic, this was your game. Created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the game quickly became a hit with kids who wanted more than just reading fantasy, they wanted to live it. And what better way than by rolling some dice and pretending to be a chaotic goblin who can't stop getting into trouble. Of course, it wasn't all fun and wizardry. The game became a lightning rod for controversy, with panicked parents and church groups convinced that the game was a one-way ticket to Satanism. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The satanic panic of the 80s had people thinking their kids were summoning demons in between rounds of Mountain Dew and pizza rolls. In reality, they were just arguing over dice calculations and whether or not their dungeon master was being too stingy with loot. Speaking of demons, these were the poor souls who had to craft the entire world and play the villains. But despite the misunderstandings, the mocking from jocks, and the occasional parental freakout, it created communities. It gave socially awkward kids a way to connect, flex their creativity, and in many cases, build friendships that lasted a lifetime. Today, those same mixtapes are the ones making blockbuster movies and writing fantasy novels. Up next is a trend and activity that still confuses us till date. Rubik's Cubes. The Rubik Cube was the very definition of a love-hate relationship among teens. If you were a teen in the late 70s or 80s, chances are you either had one, knew someone who had one, or watched in horror as some show-off solved it in under a minute, while you still couldn't get one side to match. This last one still happens today. Invented in the mid-70s by Hungarian architect Erno Rubik, the cube didn't really take over the world until the early 80s, and when it did, it became the ultimate test of intelligence, patience, and hand-eye coordination. If you could solve it, you were either a genius or a magician. For teens in that era, the Rubik's Cube was both a badge of honor and a form of torture. It was everywhere, at school, in arcades, on bedroom shelves, and sometimes even thrown against walls in frustration. There were books, competitions, and even television specials where people with lightning-fast fingers showed off their cubing skills. Back in the 80s, there was no YouTube to bail you out with tutorials. If you wanted to solve it, you had to either figure it out on your own, get a book, or find that one kid in class who had the solution memorized. And let's be real, if you could solve it, you made sure everyone around you knew. Of course, the cube wasn't just a brain teaser, it was a cultural phenomenon. Movies and TV shows featured it as a symbol of intelligence and coolness. By the mid-80s, speed cubing competitions were a thing, and solving times started dropping from minutes to seconds. The first official world championship was held in 1982, where the winning time was a mind-blowing approximate 23 seconds. These days, that wouldn't even get you in the top 100. But back then, it was pure wizardry. The Rubik's Cube never truly went away. It's still around, confusing people, and still making some folks look way smarter than the rest of us. Last but not least is a classic teen tradition that was just for having a blast. That brings us to the end of this video on teens in the 70s and 80s and how they spent their lives. See anything that caught your eye or you wouldn't mind doing? Let us know in the comments below.